Hello and welcome to Required Viewing Trends and Current Events. This is a public affairs show shot here at IPFW. It's brought to you by the Departments of History and Political Science as well as the American Democracy Project. I am one of your hosts. I'm Andy Downs from the Political Science Department. My co-host is Ann Livshiz from the History Department, and we are very happy the folks at CATV helped make this possible, and the library for actually posting it on MDON after we're done recording them.
Well, in the aftermath of midterm elections throughout the United States earlier this month that were marked both by low voter turnout and some very interesting results in some of the states, and the continuing unfolding of the preparations for the 2012 presidential election, we thought we would devote this month's show to the questions of what is it that we want from elections, and in particular, issues related to campaign finance and to election administration. And fortunately for us, one of the two co-hosts of this show is an expert in this particular field, and it's not me. So, Andy, why don't we start with campaign finance? What is the purpose of campaign finance laws?
It's actually fairly simple. What people want to know is where did you get your money and how did you spend it? And they want to know this for a variety of reasons. For example, back in the 1800s, there were indictments because of something known as the credit mobilier scandal. Members of Congress were actually brought before Congress to actually be tried for criminal acts, except there were no campaign finance rules to speak of. In fact, one person claimed that the dividend share he got for stock in a company was actually a contribution from a donor, and someone said, well, can you produce the donor? And he said, oh, I'm sorry, she's dead. So we have this desire to actually know where money comes from when you're a politician, and we want to know how you spent it. If you're going to go out and buy a lot of television time, or you're going to buy pieces of direct mail, we want to be able to hold you accountable for what you say. That's really what we're trying to do with campaign finance laws.
So these laws are relatively recent then? 20th century?
Oh yeah, definitely 20th century, and some of them very recent. I mean, we've had rules changed in the 2000s actually. Sometimes it's a little tweak, sometimes it's fairly large. In the 2000s we had something known as the McCain-Feingold legislation, which actually had sort of broad ramifications for elections at the federal level. So it's a modern invention.
So how do our current laws help achieve this purpose of knowing where it is that money comes from?
Well, that's the challenge. It really is. I mean, when you think about anytime we make a rule, somebody can look for a way to get around it. And that's the unfortunate thing. And so right now, if you are giving money to a campaign, and I should point out very quickly that the rules for federal elections are different than rules for state and local elections. And I should also point out each state has different set of rules for their state and local elections. So this is not, there's no one winner, one size fits all sort of structure here. But the basic theory at all levels is that when you receive a contribution, you have to note the name of that person, and depending on which level we're talking about, their occupation and where they live. That way people can figure it out. So if you are running for mayor, for example, and you're getting a whole bunch of money from those who own paving companies, gee, we might wonder if perhaps at some point in time you'd be letting contracts to them in favorable ways. Or if you are on the House Banking Committee and you're getting a bunch of money from bankers, gee, we might wonder a little bit about what's going on there. So the simple thing is you have to report it. Now, unfortunately, there are problems at all levels with the reporting. For example, in the state of Indiana, you really don't have to release that information very often. In fact, if you manage the campaign in such a way, you can withhold from the public who's given you money and how you've spent it by simply not paying bills and making sure the money comes in after certain deadlines. So we can go into Election Day not really knowing about some pretty significant contributions to you, which is a bit of a problem. So there are reporting issues that we run into.
And since this is relatively well known, I mean, is there an attempt to try to close the loopholes? For example, the one that you can by not paying bills and not, that you can avoid revealing your contributors? Yeah.
Now, I should point out that if somebody gives you a sizable amount of money in the days leading up to an election, in Indiana, you do have to disclose that within a certain number of hours of receiving it. However, if people are giving you $500, $250, $100, that doesn't show up in one of those large donor reports that you do have to file. There really are not a lot of attempts to change campaign finance laws, and the reason we don't see a lot of attempts, at least in the state of Indiana, is because once you start talking about changing one little part of it, you have to start talking about changing all of it. And so that becomes a problem, because people may want to make a little tweak here, a little tweak there. In the end, somebody opens it up and then suddenly everything's on the table and then nothing gets done.
So an imperfect system is better than
That's kind of the way it looks.
non-existent system?
Well, everyone knows the rules right now, and so it is kind of easy to follow what's going on if you know what you're doing. Reporters are very well aware of the tricks that people can play, and so they quite often will give us news stories about things that are going on. And so we can be informed, just not as informed as we might want to be.
So we're at the mercy of journalists doing their job and doing their job well.
Well, it's true. I mean, that is what they're supposed to do. I mean, that's the role they are supposed to play. And there are rules that we should probably make sure people are aware of. For example, there are some limits to what you can give at the federal level. There's a table that's going to start coming up on the screen right now that details what individuals can give to campaigns. For example, you as an individual could write a check for $2,500 to somebody running at the federal level. Well, you're allowed to write a check for $2,500 to somebody running at the federal level, and you can do that for each election. So in any given election year, somebody may write you a check for $2,500 for your primary and then $2,500 again for the general election. And there are limits on what you can write to, say, the national party or to a state party, and then there's even a maximum amount that you can write. But those numbers are pretty large, and for folks like us, they're not really an issue. But those things do come up. And at the federal level, it's a little bit easier to keep track of what people are doing, in part because they have to report a little more frequently, and in part because there are organizations that actually make it their business to report this information out to us. So, for example, a website that I'd send a lot of people to is actually opensecrets.org. That's www.opensecrets.org. And there you can do all sorts of research. You can look up who's given to which candidate. You can look up who's given to PACs. You can look up who's given to super PACs, who those PACs are backing, etc. It is a wealth of information that people can rely on at the federal level. That doesn't exist really at the state level, though.
Have there been any, since you mentioned that a lot of the campaign finance laws have been fairly recent, have there been any particularly controversial decisions about campaign finance lately that you think have the potential to really change the sort of the election landscape?
Well, obviously what most people think of there is the court case, Citizens United court case, and that has had wide-ranging impact already. We now know of these wonderful things called super PACs. Before we talk about super PACs, though,
anybody can get them.
Anybody can get them. Stephen Colbert being probably the best known. We actually have, we'll go ahead and advertise his super PAC for a moment here, coming up on the screen. There it is, Colbert PAC. You can go there and give money if you want. Get your name down at the bottom of his crawler in his show. But before we talk about super PACs, let's talk for a second about what are called 527s. 527 refers to a section of the IRS code, the same way 501c3s, et cetera, refer to that sort of thing. 527s were allowed to make independent expenditures supporting or in opposition to a campaign. And that meant that if I didn't like you, I couldn't coordinate my activities with your opponent, but I could run ads and send mail out against you. Super PACs have taken this to a new level. Citizens United basically says corporations can speak. And as long as you don't coordinate that speech with a political campaign, you can spend money and you don't have to worry about the limits that we saw on the screen a moment ago.
Wow, that does seem like it's going to have really profound implications. It'll be very interesting to see in the years to come, unless it gets challenged.
Well, no, it's conceivable that at the federal level they will decide to attempt to address this issue in some sort of legislation. There's been talk of that already. As soon as the Supreme Court decision came down, there was talk of that. It's not happened yet. I don't see it happening before the 2012 election, and so we'll see super PACs playing their role in 2012. In fact, if you go to opensecrets.org, it actually lists the name of the super PAC and then who they're backing or who they're opposed to, right there on the screen for you to see. So when you see a television ad from this group or that group, if you go to something like Open Secrets, you can say, aha, that's a group that's backing somebody or opposed to somebody. Very helpful. And then you can even see who's given them money.
So now we're dependent on educated populace.
I have faith in voters. I have great faith in voters.
Well, let's shift gears to issues of election administration, and there are a number of areas of concern here. And so let's go in the order of the voting process, starting with participation issues. The United States in recent years has seen historically low voter turnouts, especially in midterm elections. And this is particularly distressing to many observers, especially when we consider how much hard work and dedication went into expansion of the franchise and giving out the right to vote to many groups that previously didn't have it. And when we look at places around the world where people recently acquired the right to vote, and we see these kind of very triumphant images, you know, the famous images from '94 in South Africa, kind of the snaking lines of people having a chance to by people having a chance to vote. Iran and Afghanistan in the last few years, Egypt starting yesterday, kind of the symbol, the symbol of the finger, dipped in ink. Is this a problem for the low voter turnout for the United States? And can anything be done about it, and should anything be done about it?
Well, we have several slides that show photos of some of those great moments where people came out, often at times at threat to their own personal well-being. They went out to vote anyway, and we really don't see that here. Low voter turnout is an interesting thing because what some research has shown is that at our current levels of participation, if more people participated, it wouldn't necessarily change the outcome of a whole lot of elections. In other words, it's a good representative sample, so to speak, which is an interesting way to think about it. We do know that that there have always been attempts to try to encourage voter participation. For example, showing up on the screen right now are a series of posters from a place you know very well. Wonderful propaganda about people going out to vote in the Soviet Union. For example, this one, Soviet young people vote for a happy youth.
Well, and in the Soviet case, of course, having a high voter turnout was a way for the regime to demonstrate the unity of the people and the government, the fact that the high level of support that the government enjoyed from the people. And so the symbolic aspect of it was extremely, extremely important.
Yeah, and low turnout is a problem because you do have a small percentage of the people making decisions for the people as a whole. However, not voting is a choice. People can make the decision to not participate. In other words, I will rely on your decision as a non-voter. And when you think about a lot of elections, people start doing interesting calculations. They say, well, these two candidates are basically the same. I don't need to vote for one of them. I'll be happy with either one, or I'll be equally unhappy with either one. Some people do literally the math, and they say, my one vote will not make the difference, therefore I don't need to go out and vote because it won't make the difference. Now, of course, whenever anybody tells me that, I point out that several races around here have been decided by very slim margins and therefore are worth going out to vote. I think we do have to worry about making sure that there's always enough participation. I'm not sure what that low level is, but I'm not somebody who thinks it has to be at 75% or 100% in order for us to have a good, vibrant electoral process.
So I guess there was an editorial in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago suggesting that perhaps we, like many democracies in the West, should move towards a mandatory voting process.
Yeah, that comes up a lot.
Small fines.
Yeah, that comes up a lot. $25 fine, $50 fine if you don't go out and vote. I will enjoy watching everyone try to administer that law if we actually did that here. How much money will we spend to collect that $25 fine from you? The downside of that is that there are people who will then go out and vote for Mickey Mouse for mayor or Andy Taylor for sheriff because they are now voting out of spite. Now, countries that have mandatory voting don't see that happening that often, but it's still one of the common criticisms against mandatory voting, and part of the reason we probably wouldn't see it here. And let's remember, you've chosen to not vote. If you've not voted, therefore you have made your choice.
Well, if we move away a little bit from the participation issues to the problem of equipment, and of course some of the U.S. voting equipment has entered pop culture in very, very dramatic ways. What do you have there as your Exhibit 1?
I actually have several things to show you. First of all, this would be a punch card. For those of you who remember the 2000 presidential election, you'll remember the punch card. This is actually one of them. What happened is people went in to vote, and when they did, they pressed a little stylus, a pointy thing, at these little dots, and the dots made a little piece of paper fall off the back, the hanging chads. That became a problem in terms of counting votes. These actually are illegal in federal elections now, no longer used. So this one's gone. We don't have to worry about it. We do now, though, see a lot of these. This is an optical scan card. This is an optical scan card used here in Allen County and in a variety of counties in Indiana. What happens is each number corresponds to a candidate's name, and voters simply color in the bubble. So you don't have the hanging chad problem, but you do have a problem with people knowing which version, did I color in the right bubble? If you have eye problems, can I color it in? If you maybe have problems with your hands, that's a fairly small bubble to be filling in. And there are other versions of optical scan cards. For example, this is a voter guide actually sent out in the District of Columbia back in 2004. And inside, it shows samples of ballots that you will see. And unlike ours, the ones we use here in Allen County that require you to fill in a bubble, in this case, what you do is you actually complete an arrow. So next to each candidate's name, there's an arrow. And you just finish that arrow off. Little color in that line, and boom, then they know that's the one to count. Of course, with all of these systems, there's the potential for fraud. And obviously, with the optical scan ones, we feel a little more confident with them than we did with, say, the punch card one. Here's something else I do want to show people. This is one of my favorites. This is a sample of an old AVM, an automatic voting machine. It was all mechanical. Voters simply came in, they closed a curtain behind them by pulling a rod, and then they pushed down whatever levers they wanted to vote for, and then when they opened it back up, the levers would all go up. But because it was mechanical, you were able to cheat the system. You could actually attach rubber bands to the back of the machine so that the vote totals wouldn't go up. When it came to punch cards, the Chad problem was there, but there were also problems with it, people intentionally sort of loosening other Chads up. There are a lot of ways to defraud the system. We have to be aware of them and try to have safety precautions in place to address them.
So is there a perfect system?
Oh, there is no perfect system. Anybody who thinks there's a perfect system is going to be very disappointed because every system can be defrauded. Today, a lot of communities now use an electronic voting machine, and of course the big concern when those came out was that somebody could hack in and somehow limit or change the count, and that there's that great Simpsons scene from in 2008 where Homer's voting and he's trying to vote for one candidate and keeps saying he's voting for another candidate, lets him vote more than once, and it sort of tallies on the wrong side. So people are afraid of that. Well, you also had to be afraid that somebody was going to put rubber bands on the back of these machines, that somebody was going to mark ballots with stray marks so that they had to be thrown out. The key is to make sure that there's a system of checks and balances in place, the same way we make laws. And so in many states, that means making sure that both Republicans and Democrats are there watching what's happening, because as a rule, they don't get along. So they're not going to let the other side cheat usually.
So this is what you see as the goal of election administrators, to simply minimize the potential for fraud through the system of checks and balances.
Well, that's part of it, but we want to make sure that everybody who has the right to vote actually gets to vote too. So we can't simplify it so much to simply say it's about minimizing fraud. That's a big part of what they do. The goal really, though, is to make sure that there are free and fair elections, and that everybody who is entitled to vote gets the chance to do it, and it's an equal opportunity.
Well, and that very nicely brings us to the next potential problem with elections, and that's barriers to voting. Who puts up these? I mean, obviously the goal is to give everybody who does have a right to vote that particular right. Who puts up these barriers, and who tries to, what kind of barriers have we seen over time? Well,
unfortunately, the barriers are often put up by those who are administering the election. And sometimes they're intentional, sometimes they're not intentional. In the intentional world, we can go back to the classic literacy tests. If we go back into the 1950s, 1960s, I actually have a sample of a literacy test here. It was a 3-part test. You actually had to read part of the Constitution, and the person who was administering the test got to decide if you read it properly or not.
Wow.
And there's a section that I actually, when I go into classrooms, I will have students do this. And there is a section, Article 4, Section 1, the full faith and credit clause. For some reason, there is a consistent word that's misread, I have found over the years, and so I always get to tell the student they failed because I'm administering the test. After they read it successfully, then I ask them, what does it mean? And of course, they don't know what it means. I'm talking to 7th and 8th graders. If for some reason they get beyond that, then I get to give them a 4-question test. And it's questions like, here are 4 of them very quickly. What body can try impeachments of the President of the United States? And people will say Congress. That's not the right answer. It's the Senate specifically. Check the applicable definition for responsibility. Is it a duty, a speech, or a failure? People usually get that right. Name the Attorney General of the United States. They get that one wrong. And then, women may now serve on juries in Alabama state courts. By the time I ask that question, they are so unsure of themselves, they can't even get the obvious one right.
So, I mean, in theory, the idea of literacy, I mean, the idea that we want to make sure that people are educated and aware of of their surroundings when they go and vote is a potentially is a potentially good one. But it's interesting the way that has been so heavily politicized that of course is completely in most cases off the table in current discussions about how do we improve the process, precisely because of this ideological baggage left over from periods where specific groups were targeted for disenfranchisement.
Yeah, and policies are made over time and often incrementally. And so there are still some things in place that may make it more difficult for some people to vote than others. And that's the challenge of election administrators, to be thinking about how to deal with those particular issues. Good election administrators spend a lot of time asking themselves, if we make this change, is anyone disadvantaged who wasn't disadvantaged before? And unfortunately, sometimes it's a matter of actually balancing out and deciding what the lesser of two evils is. Sometimes you literally decide disadvantaging a small group in the interest of accuracy or security in the voting system is worth it. So, for example, Indiana's voter ID law has actually been heard at the Supreme Court level, and the ruling by the Supreme Court was, yes, a small group of people might be disadvantaged, but the security of elections is worth it in that case.
Are there any, what about the question of who counts the votes?
It's always my favorite. Who does count the votes? What used to happen back when we had paper ballots, there was a rule that said any extraneous mark on a ballot voided it. And people would literally put a piece of lead under their fingernail, and as they pulled ballots out, they'd put a stray mark on it and say, "Oh, that one's spoiled. We can't count it."
You mean the people who counted them?
Yes.
Oh my God.
And so the system is the same. You want to put two people together who are basically a check and a balance on each other, whether that's paper ballots, an AVM, optical scan, or the machines we use today.
Have there been recent cases of attempts to try to create more barriers? Do we see trends in that direction?
Well, what some people are concerned about is this idea of voter ID laws and what that does to limit people's ability to vote. You do, for example, in Indiana, have to have additional documentation to go get your driver's license now, and that can be a barrier to some people. So some people think that's the new front for barriers to voting. What people need to keep in mind is that as we are looking at problems with voting, we want to make sure that we're always trying to make sure that everybody who's entitled to vote gets to vote. Yeah.
Well, thank you. How lucky are we that we have an expert right here on the panel to be able to illuminate these particular questions.
My pleasure.
Accelerate your career with a master's degree from IPFW, Indiana University, Purdue University, Fort Wayne, your graduate university.
On required viewing, we always like to suggest some readings to you in case you found the subject interesting. We do have coming up on the screen right now a few things for you. First of all, an interesting book called When Elections Go Bad, The Law of Democracy in the Presidential Election of 2000. Obviously, a whole lot happened that year. And then the next three items are websites. The Election Assistance Commission has some wonderful information for voters in general about election administration. And then the Secretary of State's office here in Indiana, it's responsible for the administration of elections, so we recommend you go to that one. And then finally, since Secretaries of State are responsible for elections across the entire country, we recommend that you take a look at the National Association of Secretaries of State.
And for those interested in elections outside the United States, we have two books on recent Russian elections. The first one, Popular Choice and Managed Democracy, The Russian Elections of 1999 and 2000 by Timothy Colton and Michael McFall from 2003, and The Politics of Subnational Authoritarianism in Russia by Vladimir Gelman and Cameron Ross from 2010. Every show, we put a spotlight on a faculty member here at IPFW who does interesting research on a topic related to the theme of the show. This month's spotlight is on Dr. Michael Wolff, Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science. He's the author of numerous publications in various political science journals and a frequent guest on news programs and a source for local reporters. Let's hear from him.
Whenever you're ready.
This research project really began as an attempt to try and explain political civility and some of the perceived incivility that had been growing since at least 2009, but also seen into the election of 2010. And the idea was, how do we explain this uptick and what the consequences of it are, and in fact whether it is occurring. So what we found in our data, we ran 2 surveys following up on an original survey after healthcare reform. We ran some in the 2010 congressional midterm elections, and we found that indeed there's a higher perceived incivility in American politics. Further, what we saw is a connection, and that this is very closely connected to the partisan polarization that's occurring in the country. And then beyond just the ideological differences and the policy differences that are very real, we noted that, in fact, there's a second layer, kind of a mood layer, a negative mood that partisans feel toward one another, and it takes 2 different forms. The first is an unwillingness to compromise on politics. This has always historically been higher for Republicans, and there are some explanations for that, whether it's that they are less of a coalition party and not much of a need to compromise as Democrats, who have always needed to compromise with others that they've maybe disagreed with inter-party. But secondly, really the connection is maybe being out of power has led to compromise being less important for Republicans that kind of need to take a stand against the Obama administration. But further, beyond just compromise, this bleeds over into another couple of things. One, that the perception of incivility and the blame for incivility goes strictly to the other side, which is almost a siege mentality, and so it's always the other side's fault. But secondly, a real thought that negativity in campaigns, which makes it hard to ever work with the other side, is okay, and in fact is a mobilizing device for strong partisans. And the consequences is that there's very little room for deliberation left in American politics.
Mike always does some interesting research, and one of the things we like to do here at Required Viewing, in addition to giving you some suggested readings, is talk about some things that might be coming up in the news in the next month. And Ann, what do you have for us?
Well, today, Iranian students stormed the British embassy to protest recent British decisions about economic relationship with Iran, which, you know, it's a strong sense of deja vu for Americans, especially, of course.
Yeah, I would say so. Recently here in Indiana, the General Assembly had its organization day, and the deadline for them to submit bills that will be considered is coming up shortly. So people should be thinking about contacting their legislators, looking in the news for stories about what sort of things have been suggested as legislation for this particular upcoming session.
And once again, moving outside of the United States, since we're speaking of voting, as we speak, the people of Egypt are turning out in record numbers to vote. And this is a particularly interesting development, of course, because we've been watching Egypt for the past 10 months as we've seen the political developments really playing out on the streets. If these elections go through, we can finally see the discussion about the future of Egypt move from the streets and into this new legislature.
It really is a very exciting time for us to be watching things. I want to thank everybody for watching Required Viewing, Trends and Current Events. My name is Andy Downs. I'm a member of the Political Science Department. My co-host is Ann Livshiz. She's a member of the History Department. Those are 2 of the sponsors of this program, along with the American Democracy Project here at IPFW. And as always, thank you to CATV for recording this, for broadcasting it, and then also to the library here, the Helmke Library, for making it available through MDOT. Thank you very much, and have a good month.